The Arizona dawn painted Connor Hayes's backyard in shades of copper and gold as he stepped onto his weathered porch, steam rising from his morning coffee. What he saw next defied every law of physics and sanity. A woman with wheat blonde hair hung suspended from his roof beam, her slender frame swaying like a broken pendulum in the desert breeze. Crimson droplets fell from rope-burned wrists, each drop landing with surgical precision on the words, "APACHE LOVER," freshly carved and still smoldering in the timber below. Her porcelain face held an expression of profound peace, as if she were floating through the most beautiful dream instead of dangling from a noose. Connor's ceramic mug exploded against the flagstone, coffee painting abstract art across the morning shadows. He squeezed his eyes shut, counted to 3, then looked again. Empty air, swaying rope, silence. But those words remained, smoke still curling from the charred letters, like incense from an altar. In that heartbeat between disbelief and acceptance, Connor understood that his carefully constructed world was about to unravel in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. "Dad, why are you staring at the roof like that?" Ruby's voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. His 8-year-old daughter stood in the doorway, her Disney backpack slung over one shoulder, brown hair catching the early sunlight in the same way her mother's used to. Connor's heart hammered against his ribs as he glanced between Ruby and the empty beam above, searching for any trace of what he'd witnessed. The rope was gone. The woman was gone. Only those charred words remained, mocking him with their impossible presence. "Just checking for loose shingles, sweetheart." Connor managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. Ruby tilted her head with that peculiar expression she'd inherited from Mary, the one that suggested she saw far more than any child should. "Did someone write something up there?" she asked, squinting against the morning glare. "It looks like letters." Connor's blood turned to ice water in his veins. If Ruby could see the words, then he wasn't losing his mind. But that only made everything infinitely more terrifying. 24 months had passed since Mary Hayes died on a rain-slicked highway, returning from what she'd called a teaching visit to the Apache Reservation 40 miles east of Cedar Falls. Connor had never fully understood his wife's fascination with Native American culture, the way she'd disappear for entire afternoons with books about tribal traditions and healing ceremonies. He'd assumed it was just another phase, like her brief obsession with organic gardening or her attempts to learn French. Mary had always been drawn to the mysterious, the spiritual, the things that existed beyond the boundaries of Connor's practical world. Now he worked 12-hour shifts at Sullivan's Auto Repair, his hands permanently stained with motor oil and his back aching from bending over engine blocks. The garage owner, Derek Sullivan, was a hard man with harder opinions about who belonged in Cedar Falls and who didn't. But the job paid enough to keep their small ranch house and put food on the table, even if it meant Connor rarely saw daylight except through the grimy windows of the shop. Ruby attended Cedar Falls Elementary, where she'd earned a reputation for being the quiet girl who talked to invisible friends and drew pictures of animals that seemed too wise for their painted eyes. The following morning brought another impossible sight. Connor discovered a woman with wheat blonde hair sitting cross-legged on his back steps, wearing faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. She wasn't hanging from anything this time, just sitting there like she belonged, like she'd been waiting for him to find her. In her hands, she cradled a ceramic mug decorated with intricate geometric patterns that made Connor's chest tighten with unwelcome recognition. Mary had owned a cup exactly like that one, part of a set she'd brought home from one of her mysterious trips. "I'm Kaya," the woman said without looking up, her voice carrying the soft cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Sorry about yesterday's performance. I didn't expect anyone to be watching." She lifted the mug in a gesture that seemed both offering and explanation. Thought you might need coffee. You look like a man who starts his day with the strong stuff. Connor studied her face, searching for signs of madness or malice, but found only a strange calm that reminded him uncomfortably of Mary's expression during her more contemplative moments. "You were hanging from my roof," Connor said, the words sounding absurd even as they left his mouth. Kaya nodded as if this were the most natural observation in the world. "Art installation. I'm exploring themes of cultural death and spiritual suspension. The rope work gets tricky, but the visual impact is worth the discomfort." She stood with fluid grace, extending the mug toward him. "The coffee's good. I added sage. It helps with clarity." Connor wanted to demand answers, to call the police, to do any number of sensible things. Instead, he found himself accepting the cup and taking a sip of the most perfectly brewed coffee he'd tasted since Mary died. 3 days later, the air conditioning unit that kept their small house livable during Arizona's brutal summer months decided to surrender to the heat. Connor knelt beside the machine in the blazing afternoon sun, sweat dripping onto the instruction manual as Ruby wilted in the shade of the porch. The temperature gauge on his truck read 115 degrees, and the nearest repair service had quoted him a price that would eat through half his monthly budget. He was considering the financial mathematics of keeping his daughter cool versus keeping them fed when Kaya appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a battered toolbox that looked older than both of them combined. "My grandfather fixed cooling systems for the entire reservation for 40 years. She said, setting down the box and rolling up her sleeves. "Taught me everything he knew before the arthritis took his hands." Connor watched in amazement as she diagnosed the problem in minutes, her fingers moving over the machine's components with the confidence of someone who understood mechanical systems at an intuitive level. She worked in comfortable silence, occasionally humming something that sounded like a lullaby in a language Connor didn't recognize. Within an hour, cold air was flowing through their house again, and Kaya was declining his offer of payment with a wave of her hand. "Neighbors help neighbors," she said simply. "That's how it's supposed to work." The following week brought a crisis that sent Connor's carefully maintained composure into free fall. He'd taken Ruby to the grocery store for their weekly shopping trip, a routine so established that he could navigate the aisles on autopilot while mentally calculating the cost of each item against their remaining budget. But somewhere between the produce section and the cereal aisle, Ruby vanished. One moment she was examining apples with the serious concentration she brought to all decisions, and the next she was simply gone, swallowed by the store's fluorescent-lit vastness, as if she'd never existed at all. Connor's shouts echoed through the building as store employees joined the search, their voices creating a cacophony of concern that seemed to mock his terror. Security cameras were reviewed, announcements were made, and still Ruby remained missing. 30 minutes stretched into an hour, and Connor felt his world contracting to a single, horrifying possibility. That he'd failed as completely as a father could fail. That he'd lost the most precious thing Mary had left behind. Then Kaya appeared at the store's entrance, leading Ruby by the hand, both of them dusty and smiling, as if they'd returned from a pleasant walk rather than a terrifying disappearance. Ruby heard something calling to her, Kaya explained, her tone suggesting that 8-year-old children regularly followed mysterious voices into the desert behind strip malls. She followed a coyote to a place where barrel cacti grow in perfect circles. She wanted to show me the flowers. Ruby nodded enthusiastically, clutching a small yellow bloom that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Kaya taught me how to listen to the wind, Dad. It tells stories about Mom." Connor's legs nearly buckled beneath him as relief and confusion warred in his chest. Mary had often claimed that Ruby possessed an unusual sensitivity to things others couldn't perceive, but Connor had dismissed these observations as maternal pride rather than literal truth. 2 weeks later, Derek Sullivan decided to make Connor's life more complicated by docking his pay for what he termed excessive personal breaks. The reality was that Connor had been forced to leave work early twice that month to handle Ruby-related emergencies, but Derek's interpretation painted these absences as evidence of unreliability rather than responsible parenting. Connor returned home that evening feeling defeated and financially cornered, wondering how he'd manage to pay rent if his hours were cut further. He found Kaya in his backyard, sitting with Ruby under the Ramada Mary had insisted on building, both of them focused intently on something spread across the picnic table. "We're making dream catchers for the tourist shops in Sedona," Ruby announced, with the pride of someone who'd discovered a new talent. Her small fingers moved deftly through the pattern Kaya was teaching her, weaving leather strips and colorful beads into intricate geometric designs. "Kaya says people pay good money for authentic handmade stuff." Connor watched in amazement as his daughter's creation took shape, the circular frame seeming to capture light and shadow in equal measure. The finished piece possessed a beauty that transcended its simple materials, a quality that spoke to something deeper than mere craftsmanship. 3 days later, Kaya returned with an envelope containing $300, the proceeds from Ruby's dream catchers and several other pieces she'd helped create. Ruby danced around the backyard with excitement, already planning her next batch of creations, while Connor stared at the money with something approaching disbelief. It wasn't enough to solve their financial problems, but it represented hope in a way that his garage wages never could. More importantly, it had given Ruby a sense of purpose and accomplishment that reminded Connor powerfully of Mary's expression when she'd completed one of her mysterious projects. That evening, after Ruby had fallen asleep clutching her favorite dream catcher, Connor and Kaya sat on the front porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the kind of understanding that usually took months or years to develop. Mary used to say that helping others wasn't about creating debt, Connor found himself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. She believed it was just about making the world a little less difficult for everyone. Kaya turned to look at him with an expression of startled recognition, as if he'd quoted something she'd heard before in a different context. "How could you know that?" Connor whispered, suddenly aware that Kaya possessed knowledge about his family that extended far beyond their brief acquaintance. "Mary never talked to strangers about her philosophy. She barely talked to me about it." Kaya's silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of secrets too heavy for casual conversation. "The desert remembers everything," she said softly. "Every word, every prayer, every dream that gets spoken under these stars. Sometimes the wind carries those memories to people who need to hear them most." Connor was still processing this cryptic response when Ruby appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes and asking for a glass of water. As Kaya helped the little girl back to bed, Connor noticed how naturally they moved together, how Ruby seemed to trust this virtual stranger with the complete faith she'd once reserved for Mary alone. But it wasn't until he overheard Kaya answering a question Ruby hadn't yet asked, providing comfort for a fear she hadn't yet expressed, that Connor began to understand that whatever was happening between them transcended ordinary human connection. The realization should have frightened him, but instead it filled him with a longing he'd thought buried forever alongside his wife. The truth began to unravel on a Thursday afternoon when Connor arrived home early from work to find half the neighborhood gathered in his front yard, watching Kaya perform what she called an art installation. She hung suspended from the same beam where Connor had first seen her, but this time in broad daylight, before an audience of fascinated and horrified neighbors. Blood dripped from carefully applied makeup on her wrists as she spoke about the death of indigenous cultures and the silence that surrounds ongoing injustices. Her voice carried clearly across the gathering crowd, each word precisely chosen to create maximum emotional impact. "This piece is called Death of the Indigenous Spirit," she announced to the assembled crowd, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light as she swayed in her harness. "Every day, another tradition dies in silence while the dominant culture looks away. The rope represents the violence of cultural genocide. The blood represents the cost of that violence. The silence represents our collective complicity." Mrs. Peterson, Connor's elderly neighbor, leaned closer to him and whispered, "That's the artist who used to run the gallery downtown. Heard she went completely mad after Sullivan got the city to shut her down." Connor's world tilted sideways as he processed this information. He pulled out his phone and searched for Kaya Whitehorse, Arizona artist, his fingers trembling as results flooded the screen. Gallery exhibitions featuring her work had commanded prices in the tens of thousands. Newspaper articles documented a controversy that had divided Cedar Falls 8 months earlier. Art critics had praised her Sacred Spaces series for its powerful fusion of traditional Native American spiritual imagery with contemporary social commentary. But Derek Sullivan had organized a petition claiming her work promoted pagan practices that threatened the community's Christian values. That evening, Connor confronted Kaya with printouts of newspaper articles and gallery reviews, evidence of a life and career that existed entirely outside the humble persona she'd presented to him. She didn't deny anything, merely sat at his kitchen table studying the documents as if seeing them for the first time. "I was never hiding from you," she said quietly. "I just wasn't ready for you to see that part of my life yet, the part that ended when people like Derek Sullivan decided my voice was too dangerous to be heard." Her fingers traced the edge of a photograph, showing her standing proudly beside a painting that had sold for $50,000, a lifetime away from the woman who now cleaned houses to pay for basic necessities. "10 months ago, I had everything," Kaya continued, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "A gallery, a studio, recognition, financial security. Then Derek Sullivan convinced the city council that my art was corrupting local youth with anti-Christian messaging. The gallery lost its funding. I lost my space, my home, my car, even my art supplies. Everything I'd built over 15 years disappeared in a matter of weeks." Connor felt his anger rising, but it wasn't directed at Kaya. Instead, he found himself furious at Derek Sullivan, at a system that could destroy someone's life over religious prejudice, at his own unwitting participation in an economy that benefited from such destruction. "But here's what really broke me," Kaya said, pulling a folded paper from her jacket pocket. "I researched everyone who supported Sullivan's petition, looking for faces to match the hatred that destroyed my world. Your name was on the list, Connor. Derek had forged your signature along with dozens of his employees to make the petition look like it had widespread community support." Connor's hands shook as he recognized the document, remembering the day Derek had asked him to sign what he'd described as a routine business filing. He'd trusted his employer and signed without reading the contents, never imagining his name would be used to destroy someone's livelihood. "I figured out the forgery 2 weeks ago," Kaya admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I came here planning to confront you, maybe expose the hypocrisy of a man who benefited from my destruction while his daughter played with dream catchers. But then I met Ruby, and she was so much like Mary used to describe in her letters to my grandfather. And you weren't the enemy I'd imagined. You were just another person struggling to survive in a system designed to pit us against each other." Connor felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized the complexity of Kaya's motivations, the way love and anger and duty had become tangled in her heart. "Mary wrote letters to your grandfather?" Connor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kaya nodded slowly, reaching into her bag to retrieve a bundle of papers tied with leather cord. She started writing to him 18 months ago, after she began having dreams about Ruby's future. Mary saw difficult times coming and asked my grandfather to watch over her family if something happened to her. When Mary died and the gallery controversy started, Ongnoi realized the connections weren't coincidental. He made me promise to honor Mary's request, but he died before he could explain what that really meant. The letters revealed a side of Mary that Connor had never fully understood. She wrote about sensing a growing darkness in their community, about feeling called to protect Ruby's emerging spiritual gifts, about recognizing that her own mixed Apache heritage carried responsibilities she was only beginning to comprehend. Mary discovered she was 1/8 Apache during her pregnancy with Ruby, Kaya explained. Her great-grandmother had hidden that heritage out of shame and fear, but Mary felt called to reclaim it. She carved those words on your roof beam as a private celebration of the identity she was learning to embrace. Connor's anger at feeling deceived gradually transformed into something more complex as he recognized the impossible position Kaya had found herself in. She'd approached his family carrying the weight of a promise to a dead woman, her own financial and emotional devastation, and a growing love that complicated every decision she made. "I don't know what's real anymore," he admitted, looking at the woman who'd become so important to Ruby's happiness and his own tentative healing. "Did you help us because Mary asked you to, or because you wanted to, or because you felt guilty about planning to hurt me?" "All of those reasons," Kaya said simply, "and none of them. The heart doesn't follow logical progressions, Connor. Sometimes we do the right thing for the wrong reasons and discover that the reasons don't matter as much as the outcome. I love Ruby like she's my own daughter. I love you in ways that terrify me because I've lost everything before, and I know how much it hurts. But I also know that love built on partial truths isn't sustainable, which is why I'm telling you everything now, even though it might destroy what we've built together." The conversation continued long into the night, both of them working through layers of revelation and emotion that couldn't be resolved in a single evening. By dawn, Connor understood that Kaya had never been his enemy, but rather another casualty of the same system that made his own life so precarious. Derek Sullivan's petition hadn't just destroyed her career, it had weaponized Connor's name against someone whose only crime was creating art that challenged comfortable assumptions about spirituality and cultural appropriation. The realization left Connor feeling complicit in an injustice he'd never intended to support, but also determined to find some way to make amends. 3 weeks passed in an atmosphere of careful distance as Connor and Kaya navigated the new terrain of complete honesty. Ruby sensed the tension between the adults, but couldn't understand its source, her 8-year-old mind struggling to process why the easy warmth of their early relationship had been replaced by polite formality. Connor found himself missing Kaya's presence, even when she was sitting across his kitchen table, the knowledge of her complex motivations creating a barrier that intimacy couldn't cross. He wanted to trust her completely, but couldn't silence the voice questioning whether her feelings were genuine or simply the result of circumstances and obligation. The crisis that changed everything began on a Tuesday afternoon when Ruby failed to return home from school. Connor's initial assumption that she'd lingered with friends gave way to panic when calls to the school revealed she'd never arrived that morning. The teachers had marked her absent, assuming she was sick, while Connor had watched her board the school bus as usual. Somewhere in the 15-minute journey between home and school, Ruby had simply vanished from the structured safety of her daily routine into the vast uncertainty of the Arizona desert. Connor's frantic calls to police, to neighbors, to anyone who might have seen an 8-year-old girl walking alone yielded nothing but sympathetic concern and promises to keep watching. Search parties formed as word spread through Cedar Falls, volunteers combing the desert with flashlights and calling Ruby's name into the gathering darkness. Connor felt his world contracting to a single, terrifying possibility. that his failure to protect Ruby would be the final evidence of his inadequacy as a father, the ultimate betrayal of Mary's trust in his ability to keep their daughter safe. At 11:30 that night, Connor heard voices in his backyard and rushed outside to find Kaya emerging from the desert with Ruby sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. Both of them were covered in dust and scratched by desert plants, but Ruby appeared unharmed and utterly content, as if she'd spent the day on a pleasant adventure rather than missing for 15 hours. Connor's relief was so overwhelming that his legs nearly buckled, but his gratitude was mixed with confusion about how Kaya had succeeded where professional searchers had failed. Ruby heard something calling to her from the desert. Kaya explained as she transferred the sleeping child to Connor's arms. She followed a coyote deeper into the wilderness than any 8-year-old should be able to travel. She was looking for the place where her mother's spirit lives, the sacred site Mary used to visit during her dreams. Connor carried Ruby inside and settled her in her bed, noting that she clutched a small piece of pottery decorated with symbols he didn't recognize. When he returned to the backyard, Kaya was sitting on the picnic table, staring up at stars that seemed unusually bright in the clear desert air. "How did you find her when the search teams couldn't?" Connor asked, settling beside Kaya on the table's weathered surface. "How did you know where to look when I didn't even know she was capable of traveling that far on her own?" Kaya was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words carefully before responding. "In my culture, some people are born with the ability to hear the land speaking. Mary had that gift, and Ruby inherited it along with her mother's eyes and her stubbornness. When Ruby went into the desert today, I felt her distress through the same connection that allowed Mary to find our sacred places in her dreams." "You're telling me that my wife and daughter have supernatural abilities," Connor said, his voice carefully neutral, despite the impossibility of accepting such an explanation. Kaya shook her head slowly, her expression patient rather than defensive. "I'm telling you that some people are more sensitive to the natural world than others, and that sensitivity can look supernatural to those who don't share it. Mary used to disappear for hours and return with stories about places she'd never been, knowledge she couldn't have acquired through conventional means. You assumed it was imagination, but Ruby remembers those stories, and today she went looking for the truth behind them. The following morning brought revelations that recontextualized everything Connor thought he understood about his wife's mysterious interests and Ruby's unusual behaviors. Kaya led them to a hidden canyon where ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls with symbols that seemed to dance in the shifting light. Among the traditional hunting scenes and astronomical markings, Connor recognized patterns that Mary had doodled in the margins of her notebooks, designs she'd claimed came to her in dreams, but which clearly had much older origins. "Mary brought my grandfather here 8 months ago," Kaya explained, running her fingers over symbols that depicted what appeared to be a woman teaching a child to weave light into circular patterns. She'd been having visions about this place, dreams that led her to understand her connection to the Apache people who once considered this canyon sacred. My grandfather recognized her gift and agreed to teach her about her heritage, but he also warned her that such sensitivity often comes with a price. Connor studied the petroglyphs with growing amazement, recognizing in their ancient artistry the same spiritual themes that had characterized Mary's later interests. Mary didn't just discover she had Apache ancestry, Kaya continued, leading them deeper into the canyon where a natural spring created a pool of water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal. She realized that Ruby had inherited even stronger gifts, the ability to communicate with the land in ways that few people possess in each generation. Mary saw visions of difficult times ahead, and asked my grandfather to ensure that Ruby would have guidance in developing her abilities safely. She was preparing for the possibility that she might not be here to provide that guidance herself. Connor felt the pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place as he understood the true scope of Mary's preparations for a future she somehow knew she wouldn't share. The mysterious trips, the books about Native American traditions, the letters to Kaya's grandfather, all of it had been part of an elaborate plan to ensure Ruby's safety and spiritual development. "Are you saying Mary knew she was going to die?" he asked, his voice tight with emotions he couldn't quite identify. That her death wasn't really an accident? "I don't know," Kaya admitted, her honesty somehow more comforting than false certainty would have been. "But I know that the car accident happened 3 days after Derek Sullivan's petition gained enough signatures to shut down my gallery. I know that Mary's last letter to my grandfather mentioned feeling like time was running out, and I know that Indigenous women face violence at rates far higher than the general population, especially when they challenge existing power structures. Whether her death was truly accidental or something more sinister, Mary understood the risks she faced by reclaiming her heritage publicly." They returned home in contemplative silence, each of them processing the weight of revelations that changed how they understood the past and what it might mean for their future together. Connor found himself viewing Mary's death not as a random tragedy, but as potentially connected to the same forces that had destroyed Kaya's career, part of a larger pattern of violence against people who challenged the comfortable assumptions of the dominant culture. The realization filled him with anger, but also with determination to ensure that Ruby would grow up with full knowledge of her heritage and the strength to protect herself from those who might see her gifts as threatening. That evening, as they worked together to prepare dinner while Ruby played outside, Connor and Kaya talked through the implications of everything they'd learned. "I need you to know that I don't expect anything from you," Kaya said as she stirred vegetables in the pan with movements that spoke of long practice in making simple ingredients into something nourishing. "I fulfilled my promise to Mary by watching over Ruby until she was old enough to understand her gifts. If you want me to leave now that you know the whole truth, I'll respect that decision." Connor considered this offer seriously, weighing his own needs against Ruby's obvious attachment to Kaya and the practical benefits of her presence in their lives. "I don't want you to leave," he said finally, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "But I need to understand what staying means for all of us. Are you here because Mary asked you to be, or because you choose to be, or because you don't have anywhere else to go?" The question was harder than it sounded, touching on issues of autonomy and genuine affection that couldn't be separated easily from duty and circumstance. "I'm here because Ruby needs someone who understands her gifts," Kaya replied after a long pause. "I'm here because you're a good man trying to do right by his daughter in circumstances that would overwhelm most people. I'm here because this feels like home in a way nowhere else has since I lost everything. And I'm here because I love you both, not because I'm supposed to, but because you've become family to me in ways that don't depend on obligation or guilt." Her words carried the ring of truth, but Connor knew that rebuilding trust would require time and consistent actions rather than a single conversation. 18 months later, Connor stood in front of the Whitehorse Hayes Community Workshop, a building that defied easy categorization and reflected the complexity of the lives being lived within its walls. Half of the space served as an automotive repair shop where Connor fixed cars, lawn mowers, and appliances for families who couldn't afford the rates charged by larger businesses. The other half functioned as an art studio where Kaya taught children and adults to create beauty from recycled materials, transforming discarded objects into works that honored both traditional techniques and contemporary vision. The workshop represented a practical solution to their mutual needs rather than a romantic gesture, though it had become something more meaningful over time. Both Connor and Kaya required steady income. The community needed affordable repair services and creative education opportunities, and Ruby benefited from seeing the adults in her life working together toward common goals. Derek Sullivan's garage had closed 8 months earlier, not because of dramatic confrontation, but because customers gradually migrated to a business that treated them with respect rather than suspicion, that charged fair prices rather than exploiting economic desperation. Ruby, now 10 years old, moved through the workshop with the confidence of someone who understood her place in a complex but stable world. She had learned to speak several dozen words in Apache, could repair simple mechanical problems, and created art that reflected her growing understanding of her cultural heritage. More importantly, she had developed the ability to discuss her unusual perceptions without fear of ridicule or misunderstanding, knowing that the adults around her would listen with respect rather than dismissing her experiences as childhood imagination. "Kaya isn't my second mum," Ruby wrote in the journal she'd been keeping since learning to read fluently. "She's more like Dad's older sister, who knows things about plants and stories and why the wind sounds different when it's trying to tell you something important. She and Dad drink coffee together every morning and argue about whether synthetic oil is better than conventional oil for old trucks, which is pretty boring stuff. But when Dad was sick with pneumonia last winter, Kaya moved into the guest room for 3 weeks and took care of both of us without anyone asking her to. She just stayed, like Mom Mary used to stay up with me when I had bad dreams about losing people I love. The community's response to their unconventional family structure had been mixed, but gradually more accepting as people recognized the positive changes the workshop brought to Cedar Falls. Mrs. Peterson still harbored reservations about Kaya's cultural background, but had become a regular customer who appreciated Connor's honest repair work and reasonable prices. The local elementary school had approved a heritage arts program after 14 months of bureaucratic negotiation, allowing children to learn about diverse cultural traditions through hands-on creative projects. Progress remained slow and imperfect, but it was undeniably real, measurable in small victories rather than dramatic transformations. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, as the desert air carried the scent of blooming cacti and the promise of longer days ahead, Connor and Kaya sat on their back porch watching Ruby practice traditional weaving techniques in the fading light. The workshop had been particularly busy that day, with 3 car repairs, 2 appliance fixes, and a group of teenagers working on a mural that would decorate the community center's exterior wall. The work was satisfying in ways that Connor's previous employment had never been, offering direct evidence that his efforts made a tangible difference in people's lives. "Do you ever miss it?" Connor asked, gesturing toward the art supplies and unfinished projects that occupied one corner of the porch. "The gallery, the recognition, the financial security you had before everything changed?" Kaya considered the question seriously, her gaze moving from Ruby's focused concentration to the mountains that rose like ancient guardians in the distance. "I miss the freedom that money provides," she said eventually. "The ability to focus on creating art without worrying about rent or groceries or whether the truck will start tomorrow morning. But I don't miss the isolation that came with that lifestyle. The way success in the art world required me to present a version of myself that felt disconnected from my roots. The work we're doing here feels more honest," she continued, watching Ruby hold up her weaving to examine her progress in the twilight. "Teaching kids to see beauty in discarded materials, helping families afford the repairs that keep their lives running smoothly, building something sustainable rather than pursuing individual achievement. It's closer to the values my grandfather tried to instill in me before I got distracted by external validation." Connor nodded, understanding how the workshop had become something more meaningful than either of them had initially imagined, a space where practical needs and creative expression could coexist without contradiction. Ruby looked up from her weaving project and caught them watching her with the kind of attention that suggested an important conversation was taking place. "Are you guys talking about grown-up stuff again?" she asked with the exaggerated patience of someone who'd learned to tolerate adult complexity without fully understanding its necessity. "Because I finished the pattern Kaya taught me, and I want to show you before it gets too dark to see the colors properly." Connor and Kaya moved closer to examine Ruby's work, both of them impressed by the precision of her technique and the thoughtful way she'd combined traditional Apache patterns with contemporary materials. "This is really beautiful, sweetheart," Connor said, running his fingers over the intricate weaving that seemed to capture light even in the gathering darkness. "Your mom Mary would be proud of how hard you've worked to learn these skills." Ruby beamed at the praise, but then grew more serious, her expression taking on the thoughtful quality that appeared whenever she considered connections between the present and the memories she carried of her mother. "I think Mom Mary is proud," she said quietly. "Sometimes when I'm working on projects like this, I can feel her watching, like she's happy that I'm learning about the parts of our family that she didn't have time to teach me herself." As full darkness settled over Cedar Falls and the first stars appeared in the clear desert sky, the three of them remained on the porch, comfortable in each other's presence and content with the quiet satisfaction of a day well lived. Connor felt a sense of completeness that he'd never expected to experience again after Mary's death, not the desperate happiness of someone trying to recapture the past, but the deeper contentment of accepting life's complexity and finding beauty within its imperfections. Ruby had fallen asleep in Kaya's lap, her weaving project still clutched in one hand, and Connor marveled at how natural the scene appeared, how much healing had occurred in the space between loss and acceptance. "I never thanked you properly," Connor said softly, careful not to wake Ruby, but needing to voice the gratitude that had been building in his heart for months. "For finding her when she was lost, for helping us understand Mary's preparations, for staying even when it would have been easier to leave. I know you didn't choose this responsibility, but I'm grateful that you chose to embrace it anyway." Kaya smiled in the darkness, her hand stroking Ruby's hair with the gentle automatic motion of someone who'd performed the gesture countless times before. "Family isn't about the circumstances that bring people together," she replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned to distinguish between obligation and genuine affection through hard experience. "It's about the choice to keep showing up for each other, especially when it's difficult, especially when no one would blame you for walking away. Mary brought us together through her letters and her preparations, but what we've built since then belongs to us. It's ours to protect and nurture and pass on to Ruby when she's ready to carry it forward." Connor nodded, understanding that their unconventional family structure represented a kind of success that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics, but which felt more sustainable and authentic than any life he'd previously imagined for himself and his daughter. The workshop provided them with financial stability and creative fulfillment, but more importantly, it had become a gathering place where community members could find affordable services and meaningful connection with neighbors who understood the challenges of building a life in an increasingly complicated world. As they prepared to carry Ruby inside and end another ordinary day that felt extraordinary in its quiet contentment, Connor reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he'd seen a blonde woman hanging from his roof beam. The words "Apache Lover" remained carved into the beam above their heads, no longer a source of confusion or fear, but a reminder of Mary's courage in claiming her heritage and a symbol of the cultural bridge that Ruby would continue to build throughout her life. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details but grounded in the love and commitment they'd chosen to offer each other, despite the complex circumstances that had brought them together. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the desert vastness, their voices carrying ancient messages that Ruby would someday learn to interpret more fully. The wind chimes hanging from the porch roof sang softly in the evening breeze, created from materials that represented all three phases of their family's evolution. Mary's jewelry providing the melodic elements, Kaya's ceremonial bells adding rhythm and depth, and Connor's collection of spare bolts contributing the structural foundation that held everything together. Like their family itself, the chimes created harmony from disparate elements, beauty from the combination of different traditions and perspectives, music from the willingness to remain open to life's unexpected possibilities.